For 10 years, Marion Pike had lived alone. For 10 years, the mountain had kept her secrets. The silence was her shield, the solitude her armor. She had convinced herself this was enough, that safety was a fair trade for a life without touch, without love, without hope. She was 52 years old, and her heart was a fortress she'd built stone by painful stone. But the thing about fortresses is that they're meant to withstand a siege from the outside. They are never prepared for the enemy who is already waiting within. And they are certainly not prepared for the squeal of a broken wagon wheel, a sound that would not only shatter her silence, but bring her entire world crashing down. The sound started as a low groan, a complaint of wood and iron that didn't belong in the symphony of the wilderness. Marion froze, her hand on the handle of her coffee pot. Every nerve ending, honed by a decade of isolation, screamed that something was wrong. This wasn't the sound of a deer stepping on a twig or a bear lumbering through the underbrush. This was the sound of a man, the sound of civilization, the sound of trouble. She moved to the window, her body low and silent, her father's old rifle already in her hand. Through the dense curtain of pines she saw it, a tired-looking mule, a wagon listing like a sinking ship, and a man, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The wagon's rear wheel was a wreck, splintered and useless. Her first instinct was simple: do nothing. Wait for him to leave. This was her sanctuary and no one was welcome. But as she watched, the sky began to bleed from gray to a bruised purple. A storm was coming in fast, the way storms do in the Tetons, with a sudden, violent fury. The man looked up at the sky, and she saw the resignation on his face. He knew he was trapped. That's when her father's voice, a ghost she hadn't heard in years, whispered in her ear. A person stranded in the mountains isn't a stranger, Marion girl. They're a neighbor in need. That was the code of the mountains, the code of her childhood. But that was before Thomas, before she learned that a man's hand, offered in kindness, could just as easily become a fist. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, making the decision for her. She stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loosely at her side, a clear message of caution. "You there!" she called out, her voice rough from disuse. "That wheel's not taking you anywhere tonight." The man turned, and she got her first good look at him. He was maybe in his 40s, with a slight limp and hands that were scarred and stained. The hands of a blacksmith. But it was his eyes that held her. They were tired, yes, but they held no malice, no calculation. Just the simple, honest weariness of a man at the end of a long road. "No, ma'am, I don't believe it is," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Name's Jed Boone. I appear to be in something of a predicament." "There's a lean-to out back," she heard herself say, the words of her father's code spilling out against her better judgment. "You and your mule can stay the night, but I'll see what you're carrying first." He nodded, understanding her caution. He untied the canvas on his wagon, revealing the tools of his trade: hammers, tongs, and anvil. Nothing but what a blacksmith needs to make a living. It should have put her at ease. But as he turned back to face her, a small gust of wind lifted the corner of his worn jacket, and Marion saw it. Tucked into his belt was a pistol, a military-issue Colt, the kind an officer might carry, and beneath it a small leather-bound book with a faded gold crest on the cover, a crest she recognized, a crest that made the blood in her veins turn to ice. It was the crest of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. The Pinkerton crest burned in her mind, a symbol of men who hunted other men for money, men who asked questions and never gave up, men like the ones her husband Thomas would hire. Her carefully constructed piece shattered into 1,000 pieces. This wasn't a stranded traveler. This was a hunter, and she was his prey. Her hand tightened on the rifle. The storm was breaking now, the rain coming down in blinding sheets. He stood there watching her, waiting. He must have seen the change in her face, the recognition. He must have known the game was up. But he just stood there, letting the rain soak him, his expression unreadable. "Best get that mule under cover," she said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. It was the only thing she could think to do. To let him in was madness. To turn him away in this storm was a death sentence. And even after everything, she wasn't a murderer. And besides, she needed to know. She needed to know for certain. He led his mule to the lean-to, his limp more pronounced in the slick mud. She watched from the cabin door, the rifle never leaving her side. Every move he made seemed calculated, every glance a threat. When he was done, he turned to her. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "You have no idea what this means." "Oh, I think I do," she thought. The night was the longest of her life. She didn't sleep. She sat in her rocking chair by the cold fireplace, the rifle across her lap, listening to the storm rage outside and the even greater storm rage inside her. Who was he? How had Thomas found her after all this time? Had this man, Jed, been watching her for days? Weeks? Was this broken wheel just a clever trick to get inside her defenses? Morning came, gray and wet. She looked out the window and saw him already at work on the broken wheel. The sight was so ordinary, so mundane, that it almost made her doubt what she had seen. He moved with a craftsman's focus, his scarred hands gentle on the splintered wood. Then he looked up and saw her watching. He didn't smile. He just nodded, a simple acknowledgement before turning back to his work. The day passed in a haze of suspicion. She fed him on the porch, leaving the plate on the top step and retreating back inside. They didn't speak. The only sounds were the rain dripping from the eaves and the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his hammer. He was good. She had to admit that. He wasn't just patching the wheel, he was rebuilding it, forging new iron fittings in a small, portable forge he'd set up. The skill was mesmerizing, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. He was drawing her in, making her forget the Pinkerton crest, the pistol, the cold certainty that he was here to destroy her. That evening, the rain finally stopped. The air was clean and cold. He was washing his hands in the rain barrel when he finally spoke. "The wheel is done," he said, not looking at her. "I can be gone by morning." It was what she wanted. It was what she needed. For him to be gone, for her life to return to its silent, safe rhythm. So why did the thought of him leaving send a strange, unwelcome pang through her chest? "That's good," she managed to say. "You'll be glad to get on your way." He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were full of a sadness she didn't understand. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "I don't think I will be." And then he did something that terrified her more than any weapon. He took a step toward her. "I know what you saw," he said. "The book. I know what you think I am." Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the confrontation, the end of her freedom. "I'm not here to hurt you, Marion," he said, and the sound of her name on his lips was a violation. "I'm here to warn you." "Warn me?" she spat, the word full of a decade of fear and rage. "Men like you don't give warnings. You deliver packages, and I know who sent you." Jed held up his hands, a gesture of peace that she didn't trust for a second. "You're right. Thomas Hartwell sent me. He hired the agency a year ago. Said his wife had a nervous breakdown, that she'd run off, and he was worried for her safety." The story was so practiced, so perfect. It was the same lie Thomas had told their friends, their family, the doctor who had put stitches in her lip, and accepted the story about her falling down the stairs. It was the lie that had driven her into the mountains in the first place. "He gave me your name, a 10-year-old photograph, and a region the size of a small state to search," Jed continued. "He painted a picture of a fragile, confused woman who needed to be brought home for her own good. And you believed him," she said, her voice flat and dead. "At first," Jed admitted, his gaze unwavering. "The money was good, and he was a convincing man. But the longer I looked, the more questions I had. I started talking to people in the towns you might have passed through, and I heard things. Stories that didn't match the concerned husband. Stories about a man with a cruel temper and a possessive nature." He took another slow step closer. She didn't back away. "And then I found you," he said, his voice dropping. "And you were nothing like the woman he described. You weren't fragile. You were the strongest person I'd ever met. You weren't confused. You were smart, capable. You had built a life here, a fortress. And I realized I wasn't hunting a fugitive. I was tracking a survivor." Every word was a hammer blow against the wall she'd built around her heart. Could it be true? Could this man, this hunter, have truly seen her? Not the broken wife, not the crazy woman in the mountains, but the person she had fought to become? Her mind screamed at her not to believe him. It was a trick, a clever, cruel trick to get her to lower her guard. But her heart, that foolish, stubborn thing she thought had turned to stone, whispered a different story. "Why tell me this now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because he's coming, Marion," Jed said, and the urgency in his voice was undeniable. He grew impatient. He's on his way here himself, with other men, men who aren't just investigators, men who get paid to do whatever he asks, no questions. The world tilted on its axis. Thomas. Here, the nightmare she had outrun for 10 years was finally catching up to her. "How long?" she whispered. "A day. Maybe two," Jed said grimly. "That's why I broke my own wagon wheel. I had to get to you. I had to find a way to warn you, to help you." He looked at the rifle in her hands, then back at her face. "I know you have no reason to trust me. I know I'm the enemy. But right now, I might be the only friend you've got." The air was thick with impossible choices. If he was lying, trusting him would be the last mistake she ever made. But if he was telling the truth, sending him away would be suicide. She had survived for 10 years on her own instincts. She had learned to read the signs, to trust the feeling in her gut that screamed of danger. And right now, looking into Jed Boone's tired, honest eyes, her gut was telling her something that terrified her more than anything Thomas Hartwell could ever do. It was telling her to trust him. And then, as if the world wasn't already ending, they heard it. The sound of a horse moving fast up the trail. Not the slow, plodding pace of a traveler, but the urgent, purposeful gallop of a man with a mission. Jed's hand went to the pistol on his belt. "That's too soon," he breathed. "He shouldn't be here yet." They watched as a lone rider broke through the trees. He wore a dusty coat and the unmistakable silver star of a U.S. Marshal on his chest. He pulled his horse to a stop in front of the cabin, his eyes sweeping over the scene. The half-repaired wagon, Jed with his hand on his gun, and Marion in the doorway with her rifle. "Afternoon," the marshal said, his voice calm and steady. "I'm looking for a woman by the name of Marion Pike, or maybe you know her as Marion Hartwell." He wasn't looking at her. He was looking straight at Jed. "But that's not the only reason I'm here." The marshal reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A wanted poster. "I'm also looking for a man, a former Army captain wanted for desertion." He unfolded the paper. The sketch was crude, but the resemblance was undeniable. "A man by the name of Jedediah Boone." The marshal's words hung in the air, colder than any mountain winter. A deserter. Jed wasn't just a Pinkerton. He was a wanted man. The trap had sprung, but it wasn't the one she'd expected. Thomas hadn't just sent a man to find her. He'd sent a man the law was already hunting. It was a work of cruel genius. No matter what happened, Thomas won. If Jed brought her in, he got paid. If Jed was captured, Thomas could claim the poor, unstable wife had been taken by a dangerous fugitive, making him a victim and a hero all at once. Jed didn't move. His face was a mask of stone, but Marion could see the storm in his eyes. He was trapped, and he knew it. "I'm Marshal Cole Bennett," the lawman said, his gaze flicking between them. "Now, Mr. Boone, Mr. Hartwell was kind enough to inform me of your likely whereabouts. Said you might be mixed up in his family business. He's a very influential man, Mr. Hartwell. Has friends in high places." The threat was clear. This wasn't just about the law. This was about power, Thomas's power. "He also told me a story," Bennett continued, his eyes finally landing on Marion, "about his poor, sick wife, a woman prone to violent fantasies, a woman who attacked him and fled into the wilderness. He has documents, doctor's reports, a court order giving him full custody of his wife and her affairs." It was worse than she could have ever imagined. He hadn't just told lies, he had made them law. She wasn't a person anymore. She was property, and he had the paperwork to prove it. "Now I see two fugitives," the marshal said, his hand hovering over the butt of his pistol. "One from the army, and one from her loving husband. The easy way is you both come with me. The hard way, well, the hard way is a lot more paperwork for me." Jed slowly took his hand away from his gun. "The woman is innocent," he said, his voice low and steady. "Hartwell is the criminal. He abused her for years." The marshal sighed, a theatrical, world-weary sound. Son, I've been a lawman for 20 years. Every man in a jail cell says he's innocent, and every woman who runs from her husband says he was a monster. The law is the law, and the law says she goes with him. This was it, the end of the line. 10 years of survival, undone by a piece of paper and a man with a silver star. She could feel the old fear creeping back in, the helpless feeling of being trapped in a cage not of her own making. But then she looked at Jed. He was a wanted man, a deserter, a man with his own demons. But he had come to warn her. He had risked his own freedom for hers. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But alongside it, something new was growing, a hot, bright flame of fury. She had not survived blizzards and bears and starvation just to be dragged back to her personal hell by a man in a shiny badge. "What if you're wrong?" Marion said, her voice clear and strong. The marshal looked at her, surprised. "What if he's telling the truth? What if the man you're working for is the monster? Are you so sure you're on the right side of this, Marshal?" Bennett's eyes narrowed. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "The evidence says—" "The evidence was bought and paid for," Marion shot back, taking a step forward. "The truth is standing right in front of you. The truth is in the scars you can't see. Are you going to trust a rich man's wallet or your own two eyes?" The air crackled with tension. It was a standoff. Three people on a lonely mountainside, their lives hanging in the balance. The marshal was a man of the law, a man who followed orders, but he was also a man who had seen the darkness of the world. Could he see the truth here? Could he see past the lies Thomas had so carefully constructed? Before Bennett could answer, another sound cut through the air, the sound of more horses. Three riders broke through the tree line, moving with a confident, predatory swagger. At their head was a man with silver hair and a cruel, handsome face that had haunted Marion's dreams for a decade. Thomas Hartwell had arrived. "Ah, Marshal Bennett," Thomas said, his voice smooth as poison. "I see you found my darling wife, and it appears she's taken up with a rather disreputable companion." He smiled, but it didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. "Thank you for your service. My men and I can take it from here." And that's when Marion knew. Bennett wasn't just working for Thomas, he was on the payroll. This was never about the law. It was a kidnapping, sanctioned by a bought and paid for badge. The trap hadn't just sprung, it was closing in for the kill. Thomas Hartwell dismounted, moving with the easy arrogance of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. He looked at Marion, not as a long-lost wife, but as a prized possession that had been recovered. His gaze was a physical weight, suffocating her. "Marion, darling," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Look at you, so thin. This wilderness has not been kind to you. But don't worry, we'll have you home soon. We'll get you the help you so desperately need." He gestured to the two men with him. They were not lawmen. They were hard-faced thugs, their hands resting on the guns at their hips. Marshal Bennett shifted uncomfortably, a man suddenly realizing he was a pawn in a much darker game than he'd signed up for. "Mr. Hartwell," Bennett began, "the deserter, Boone, will be dealt with." Thomas cut him off, his voice turning to steel. "He has interfered with my private property. That is a mistake he will come to regret." He took a step toward the cabin, his eyes fixed on Marion. "Now, Marion, let's not make this any more difficult than it needs to be. Come with me." The world seemed to slow down. This was the moment she had dreaded for 10 years. The final confrontation. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to disappear back into the wilderness that had protected her for so long. But she looked at Jed, standing his ground, even with the odds impossibly stacked against him. She looked at the smug, possessive face of her tormentor, and she felt the cold, hard weight of her father's rifle in her hands. The woman who had fled into the mountains was gone. The woman standing on the porch now had faced down starvation, had killed for her food, had learned that survival was not a passive act. It was a fight. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it echoed in the mountain air with the force of an avalanche. Thomas stopped. He actually looked surprised. "What did you say?" "I said no." Marion repeated, raising the rifle until it was pointing directly at his chest. I am not your darling. I am not your wife. And I am not going anywhere with you. A flicker of genuine rage crossed Thomas's face before he masked it with a condescending chuckle. Oh, Marion, still so dramatic, still playing the victim. He turned to Bennett. You see, Marshall, this is what I have to deal with. Her delusions are getting worse. She's a danger to herself and others. She doesn't look dangerous to me, Jed said, his voice cutting through the tension. She looks like a woman who's finally fighting back. You will be silent, deserter, Thomas snarled, his mask of civility finally slipping. Your opinion is worthless. He looked back at Marion, his eyes burning with a cold fire. Last chance, Marion. Put the gun down. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She just held his gaze, channeling a decade of silent fury into this one moment of defiance. Then so be it, Thomas said softly. He gave a slight nod to his men. The world exploded. The first shot didn't come from Thomas's men. It came from Jed. His Colt seemed to leap into his hand, barking once. One of the thugs cried out and crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg. Then all hell broke loose. Marion fired, the rifle bucking against her shoulder. She didn't aim to kill. She aimed for the other thug's gun hand, and the man screamed as his pistol went flying. It was a shot born of 10 years of hunting, of knowing exactly where to place a bullet. Bennett, the corrupt marshal, drew his weapon, but he was hesitant, caught between the man who paid him and the sudden, shocking violence of the resistance. Jed used that hesitation. He fired again, and Bennett's gun was knocked from his hand, his wrist suddenly useless. In seconds, the odds had changed. It was now 2 against 1. Thomas stood alone, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had come here expecting a timid, broken woman. He had found a warrior. He had underestimated her. And he had underestimated the bond she had formed with the deserter he had sent to trap her. He reached for his own gun, a small, elegant pistol tucked into his coat. But he was a rich man who bought his violence, not a man who practiced it. He was slow. Jed was not. The Colt barked a third time. Thomas cried out, not in pain, but in shock as the pistol was shot from his grasp, his fingers numb and useless. He was unarmed. He was vulnerable. He was, for the first time in his life, completely powerless. He stared at Marion, at the rifle she still held steady, and for the first time she saw real fear in his eyes. The fight wasn't over. She knew that, but the battle for her soul, the one she had been fighting in silence for a decade, had just been won. She was no longer running. She was no longer hiding. She was standing her ground, and her tormentor was at her mercy. The silence that fell was more profound than any she had known in her 10 years on the mountain. It was the silence of a world turned upside down. Thomas Hartwell, the man who had controlled every aspect of her life, knelt in the dirt, disarmed and defeated. His hired thugs were out of the fight, and the Balt Marshal was cradling his shattered wrist, his face pale with the realization that he had backed the wrong monster. Marion kept the rifle trained on Thomas. Her hands were steady. Her heart was calm. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long was gone, burned away by the heat of the fight. It's over, Thomas, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. He looked up at her, his face a twisted mask of hatred and disbelief. This changes nothing, he hissed. I have the law on my side. I have the courts. You will be hunted for this, you and your deserter friend. The law? A new voice cut in. All heads turned. Stepping out of the woods was another man. He was older, with a weathered face and a real U.S. Marshal's badge pinned to his dusty vest. A badge that was old and worn, not shiny and new. He held a shotgun leveled at the group. The law is standing right here, the real Marshal said, and I've been listening for the last 10 minutes. I got an anonymous tip about a man impersonating a marshal in this area. Looks like I found him. He nodded toward the cowering Bennett. The real Marshal's eyes moved to Thomas. I've also been asking questions in Jackson about you, Mr. Hartwell. Seems a lot of people have stories about you. Stories about your temper. Stories about a young wife who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The color drained from Thomas's face. His web of lies, so carefully spun, was unraveling all at once. His power, built on money and intimidation, was useless against the simple, unadorned truth. "This is a misunderstanding," Thomas stammered, trying to regain his composure. "My wife is unwell." "Your wife looks like she's doing just fine to me," the marshal said, his gaze settling on Marion with a look of respect. "Looks like a woman who's learned how to take care of herself." He then looked at Jed. "As for you, Captain Boone, your file came across my desk a month ago. The Army wants you for desertion, but the file also mentioned something else. It mentioned you were investigating threats against your commanding officer, that you went undercover to expose a ring of war profiteers selling faulty equipment. The charges were only filed after you disappeared, almost like someone wanted you silenced." Jed stared at the marshal, a slow dawn of understanding on his face. He hadn't been a deserter. He had been set up. And the men he was investigating, the men who profited from the death of soldiers, had friends in high places. Friends like Thomas Hartwell. It all clicked into place. Thomas hadn't just hired Jed to find Marion. He had hired a man he could eliminate, a loose end from another, darker part of his life. Thomas saw his world collapsing. With a desperate roar, he lunged, not at Marion, not at the marshals, but at Jed. He saw the wounded soldier as the source of all his problems. It was a fatal mistake. Jed, even with the odds now in his favor, had never let his guard down. He moved with the fluid grace of a man trained for combat, sidestepping Thomas's clumsy attack. Thomas stumbled past him, his momentum carrying him forward, directly into the path of Marion. She didn't think. She reacted. She swung the heavy rifle like a club, the solid wood stock connecting with Thomas's temple with a sickening crack. He dropped like a stone and did not move again. The silence returned. The real marshal slowly lowered his shotgun. He looked at Thomas's still form, then at Marion, then at Jed. "Well," he said, his voice dry as dust, "looks like a whole lot of problems just got solved." He walked over to the fake marshal, Bennett, and pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "You're under arrest for impersonating a federal officer to start." He looked at Jed. "Captain Boone, I suspect the Army will be very interested to hear your side of the story. I think we can get those desertion charges cleared up." Finally, he looked at Marion. He saw the cabin, a fortress of self-reliance. He saw the woman, forged into steel by hardship. He saw the end of a long, dark road. "As for you, ma'am," he said, his voice softening, "I believe this is a clear case of self-defense. In fact, I don't think I saw a thing." He tipped his hat to her. "You have a good day now." And just like that, it was over. 10 years of running, 10 years of fear, ended not with a whimper, but with a bang. Marion stood in the sudden, quiet aftermath, the rifle smoke mingling with the clean mountain air. Jed came to her side, his hand gently taking the rifle from her. Their fingers brushed, a small touch that felt like a bolt of lightning. She looked up at him, at this man she had thought was her enemy, this man who had turned out to be her savior. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that her 10 years of solitude were finally, truly over. 3 weeks later, the sound of a hammer on an anvil was a comforting rhythm against the mountain silence. The broken windows of the cabin had been replaced, the splintered door rebuilt, stronger than before. The graves, hidden in a grove of pines, were already being reclaimed by the wilderness. The law had come and gone, and the story of Thomas Hartwell's demise was recorded as a simple, if tragic, case of a man getting what he deserved. Jed's name was cleared. The deserter was a hero, it turned out, and the Army was more interested in the powerful men he could identify than in punishing him for taking an unauthorized leave to save a life. He was free, and he had chosen to stay. Marion watched him from the porch. He wasn't fixing a wagon wheel or a broken tool. He was working on something small, something intricate, shaping a piece of raw iron with a tenderness that seemed impossible for his scarred hands. When he was finished, he quenched the metal in a bucket of water, the hiss of steam like a final sigh. He walked over to her, his limp barely noticeable now. He held out his hand. Lying on his palm was a ring. It wasn't gold or silver. It was simple, dark iron, forged into a delicate, twisting vine. It was a blacksmith's ring, strong and honest and beautiful in its imperfection. "It's not much," he said, his voice quiet, But iron is what I know. It remembers how it's treated. If you force it, it breaks. But if you're patient, if you're kind, it can be shaped into something that will last forever. Marion looked from the ring to his face, at the gentle hope in his tired eyes. This man had seen the worst of the world, in war and in peace. He was wounded just as she was, but he had never let the darkness extinguish the goodness inside him. "I was married once," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The ring he gave me was heavy. It felt like a chain." She held out her left hand. "This," she said, her voice growing stronger, "this feels like a promise." Jed slipped the iron ring onto her finger. It was still warm from the forge. It fit perfectly. "Marion Pike," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not a man of fancy words. All I know is that for 15 years, I've been wandering. I thought I was running from the war, from the man it turned me into. But maybe I was just looking for you." Tears she thought had long since dried up welled in her eyes. "And I've been hiding," she confessed. "I thought I was hiding from Thomas, but maybe I was just waiting for a man who was brave enough to find me." They stood on the porch of the small cabin, two survivors who had found a sanctuary, not in a place, but in each other. The mountains that had once been her prison were now simply home. The silence that had been her shield was now filled with the comfortable presence of another heartbeat. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or desperation. It was a kiss of quiet understanding, of shared history, of a future they would build together, piece by piece like a blacksmith at his forge. It was the first gentle touch she had known in over a decade, and she knew it would not be the last. The sun began to set, painting the Teton Peaks in hues of orange and purple. A new life was beginning, one built not on fear and survival, but on courage and trust. It would be a simple life, a quiet life, but it would be their life, and it would be enough. If a story about finding light in the darkest of places speaks to your heart, and you believe in the power of courage to rewrite our endings, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the story we have coming for you tomorrow.